Employers hire employees to do a job, but your employees hire you to do a job as well. And the quicker you can find out why they're hiring you to do that job for them, the more likely you are to figure out how to find ways to create an employer-employee contract where there's value that is exchanged on both sides.
Welcome to Rise and Stride, where we empower you to take your next step in an ever-changing business landscape. Here's your host, Denise LeDuc-Frimme, President and CEO of the California Society of CPAs.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Rise and Stride, where we bring together diverse voices to explore leading topics to help you navigate the seemingly ever-changing business landscape that is also very uncertain. So today will be a real pleasure for you to hear from Al. So today, our guest is Al Dea, a podcaster, talent and leadership development consultant, keynote speaker, facilitator, and an expert in workplace trends, careers, and talent. Al's career has included stints at Salesforce and Deloitte, where he advised Fortune 500 companies on developing and executing digital transformation and talent strategy. Along with Fortune 500 companies, Al works with higher education institutions and organizations to design talent strategies that attract and retain diverse talent and build leadership programs that help employees and leaders develop the human skills they need to thrive in the changing world of work. And Al, I can't say enough of how I appreciate your podcast and the topics you highlight. And I think it's honestly a treasure trove of information. And I think are you on your 200th episode or something?
I'm pretty close coming up.
Excellent. Well, so much good information. And I know our audience today will really appreciate hearing from you, especially as we talked about when we just got on navigating a lot of the uncertainties that are out there and the change that's out there with technology and just everything else that's shifting around.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. It's wonderful to be here. Always enjoy chatting with you. And so I'm delighted to chat today.
Yeah, thank you. But maybe we always like to get started asking, how did you start on your career path? I talked about Salesforce, Deloitte. I know you were with MIT too for a while. So give us, your just insights into how that career transformed.
Sure. Happy to do that. So I guess going back to the beginning, I mean, I was a business and philosophy major in college, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew that I liked solving problems. I liked working in teams, and I genuinely was interested in business. And so I went the route of becoming a management consultant. And as you mentioned, I joined Deloitte Consulting, where I spent the majority of the first part of my career in really working at the intersection of technology transformation and organizational transformation. And really thinking about at the time, this new world of the internet and digital technology, how could it be used in ways to better deliver better customer experiences or better employee experiences? And more so, though, the implications that those technology changes and transformations had on people. And that's really, I think, where kind of my interest in the intersection of individual change, organizational change, and market change really kind of came into play for me. So that was the very first start of my career. It was, kind of in the professional services realm, which I believe many of the folks who listen to this podcast can, appreciate. But from there, after, getting my MBA and after spending a little bit more time at Deloitte, I kind of wanted to not just kind of talk about and help companies kind of navigate technology change. I wanted to find out what it would be like to actually go work for one of these companies. And so, as you mentioned, I spent some time at Salesforce, which at the time was a fast-growing, technology company, really transforming the way that companies thought about how they manage customer relationships. And so I spent a good period of time there. And again, kind of working at this nexus of technology change and organizational change.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it really was, kind of at Salesforce where I really started to get really more deeper into the human side of change and the people side of change. And what I learned in that experience, though, which is, again, I'm assuming I know that a lot of the people listening to this probably understand each and every day, which is, yes, the technology is important. Yes, we need to understand it and learn it. But at the end of the day, like, it really is about people and any type of change you're trying to drive, whether it's a new policy, a new regulation, whether it's adapting to a new standard, whether it's fundamentally rethinking your business. The technology matters, but it's a lot about the leadership, the culture, and the willingness to learn. And so that kind of brought me into the next phase of my journey, which is where I am now. So for the past almost 4 years, I've been running my own talent and leadership development consulting practice. And so I work with organizations who are thinking about change and trying to make sure that their leaders are equipped with the right skills and abilities to kind of lead change and to lead change in times that are continuously changing and evolving, and in some cases uncertain. And so I do that through consulting, I do that through training, I do that through the podcast that I have. But again, it kind of really started kind of back, working in professional services and many of the lessons that I learned there.
Mm-hmm. I just think about the tech and organizational change, and you probably didn't realize at that time how really important and critical it would be.
Yeah.
Because since then, it's just been moving so fast, and that line or connection or whatever, the circles that are connected, it's really blurring.
Mm-hmm. You're 100% right. And I think those, again, not to beat on a drum here, but those of the folks who are listening who work in professional services, you probably have seen this over the definitely most recently, but definitely over the past 10 to 15 years. And even I just think about the accounting profession and how much technology has really transformed the way in which we think about the profession, the nature of how work gets done, and anything like that. And for me, who knew that just having an awareness of this thing called Facebook and Twitter and the like could actually end up becoming something that would enable me to, or my ability behind understanding how these things worked and how they impact people could be my own launch pad for my career and for that matter, even many of the pivots and changes that I've made within it.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to just, put a headline at the top here before we start to get into other topics. But, there is the tech headline out there and AI and replacing jobs. And, it's not going to replace you unless you don't use AI, and then it will replace you. But you've talked about traditional resilience, and then you talked about a shatterproof leader. Mm-hmm. And what are those core elements? So maybe you can, I love that, the shatterproof leader. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I think what you're referencing is I had on the podcast, my own podcast, The Edge of Work, a friend and mentor of mine, Dr. Tasha Eurich, who recently wrote a book called Shatterproof. And so if you're not familiar with Dr. Tasha Eurich, she has done a lot of work on self-awareness. And this book is her third book, I believe, and she's written 2 New York Times bestselling books. But her book, Shatterproof, is literally called Shatterproof: How to Thrive in a World of Constant Chaos and Why Resilience Alone is Not Enough. And so I brought Tasha on, one, because I always enjoy talking with her and learn so much, but some of the work behind this book that Tasha just wrote, which you should all check out, really goes to great lengths to better understand this concept of resilience, which I think is one of those things that I think most of us genuinely kind of are like, yeah, like who wouldn't want to be resilient, right? And Tasha agrees, but oftentimes it gets thrown around and it's never really fully defined. And so, I think one of the reasons why Tasha's work is so important is because she actually went and did some of this research on this. And what she basically found was that if you actually take a look at the textbook definition of resilience, what it actually means is, and how it's defined, is basically more or less getting to a point where you don't feel pain, which is not a bad thing. But if that's what we're defining as resilient, that feels, it's kind of like the concept of necessary but insufficient. Like I don't want people. I don't want people going around feeling like, oh well, I'm at a point where I just don't really feel pain.
Kind of numb.
Right. Like what you really want to think, and what she argues in terms of Shatterproof, is thinking about how do you get to a point where you can move beyond that, right? And part of the other reason why she went and studied this and thought it was so important is because I think there's a tendency, particularly for leaders sometimes, and particularly those who are high achieving, to just want to power through things, right? And Tasha actually, again, her words, not mine, actually came up with a term called great gaslighting, which is basically just like, well, if I just work harder, right? If I just push through, then I'll be fine. And, or kind of saying to yourself, like, I should be able to do this because I'm strong, and like if I can't, well then like, I'm just not being resilient enough. And she kind of offers a different perspective on that of like, no, like sometimes crap you go through is hard, right? And like call a spade a spade. Like you don't need to pretend that something doesn't suck when it actually sucks.
Mhm. I think that it's simple. When a lot of times you ask someone how you're doing, or you just are in passing, right? We tend a lot of times to say, "Oh, good," but we don't really say what we feel or what's happening. And so I like that grit gaslighting.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. No, I think, look, like I think it's a reality. Like I don't, like you do, Denise, like I talk to leaders of organizations, pretty much every week. And I don't know, a leader right now who isn't, going through at least one thing that like most reasonable people would agree, like, oh, that seems pretty challenging, if not multiple things like all at once. Right.
Mhm.
And, in the context of leadership, I mean, you're absolutely on the hook to deliver and be held accountable. And it brings back to, shatterproof or resilience. If you're kind of grit gaslighting yourself, or if you're just trying to power through without taking into account like the lived reality of what you're experiencing, that has downstream implications for anyone who you touch as a leader, right? And, that's the thing about being a leader, like stuff rolls downhill. And so the way that you show up and how you interact and engage, that flows to all the people that you lead. Like, yes, I have to deliver. Yes, I have to figure out how to make sense of this uncertainty or whatever challenge I'm, in front of. And I can also hold space for myself to make sure that like I'm doing what I can to be able to actually do that at the best of my ability, because I need to, because if not, that's going to have downstream implications for anyone that I lead. So,
Mhm. That's an important piece, because you have to have time for yourself, like you said, in order to be there for the others, right? To show up. It's key, because sometimes we don't take that time.
for sure, 100%.
So when we think about, what's happening out there, tech, uncertainty, you do a lot of training, like you said, and consulting from a management level. So tell me what you're seeing and how that's evolving with how managers need to show up and need to communicate.
Sure. Well, so I mean, I think there's a couple things that kind of come with this. So I think there's a couple things that I think are age old and continue to remain relevant, but perhaps because of the context, either become more important or or more magnified. Very first one that comes to mind is this idea of providing clarity, right? I think that has always been something that great managers do and what great employees want from their managers, and I don't think that has changed. I think what has changed is what we've talked about in terms of how fleeting clarity can sometimes seem in a world that continuously is changing, or for that matter, when you work in an industry where there are many things potentially changing all at once. And so that is not necessarily something that is new, but I think it gets magnified because of the context and the environment that we are in now. I think the second thing that probably is and will remain kind of the same and will always remain the same is that, good leaders and employees want good leaders who can provide development and growth. I think that all of us intrinsically are motivated to a certain degree, in the workplace by the ability to know that, we're either able to rise to the level of our abilities, or that we have the ability to kind of progress or advance in some kind of way. And I think that the best leaders and managers are able to do that in some kind of capacity in terms of supporting that growth and development, helping people rise to their abilities or their potential, or creating space so that these people can be actively developed. In terms of, perhaps what's new or perhaps what's evolving, I think that there is kind of this growing understanding from the organizational level that perhaps, particularly for organizations that are mid-sized to large, the first line managers and maybe the middle managers in the past, perhaps they have been underinvested in, and they are so critical to the success of an organization that I wouldn't necessarily say that there is made the commiserate investment that's been made, but like I think there's a growing awareness that in particular those areas really need to be done well in order to drive business results. I mean, again, putting this back into the accounting profession for a second, those engagement managers, if you're in a professional services firm, they're the lifeblood of really being able to drive results in the day to day. And when done right, they are who you have up next, to eventually, take over leadership of the firm. And so if you're not thinking about how you're developing them, both for the short term, but for the long term, having sustainable growth as a firm is going to be, kind of really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think another thing that I would say perhaps is changing and evolving is that I think that we are in a day and an age where the broader nature of the employer-employee contract is changing and evolving. We are not necessarily in an environment anymore where you kind of do your 4 and 40, like my mom did, working for after college, working for the same company for 40 years. Lifetime employment isn't guaranteed. Even in industries where there might be talent shortages or growing opportunities, things just move so fast that you can't, stability and lifelong employment is just not a thing in the past. And so I think there's a kind of moving shift and an acknowledgement that, that part of the traditional employer contract isn't necessarily something that is as prevalent. And so I think in a lot of ways, it kind of puts leaders in this weird position of figuring out, how do we find ways to hold on to the people when we can't necessarily promise them, that they're going to be here forever? And for that matter, more tactically, we're in an economic period right now, and particularly in a lot of industries, where there maybe isn't a lot of growth happening. And when there's not growth happening, that might mean that there isn't necessarily room for promotions or raises or things. And so how do we find ways to kind of, as leaders, motivate, engage, retain people when some of the traditional levers kind of aren't there? And the last thing I would just say, and this is early, but it's definitely coming up in conversations, is really honestly, really rethinking what management and leadership is. And this is happening for two reasons, I think. The one obvious one, which is around artificial intelligence, right? And in a world where if we do have more reliance on AI systems and machines, what does it mean to manage and lead when the people you're managing and leading aren't maybe people, but are also, systems and agents and things and bots, right? And in some ways, it actually makes the act of management even more important, because those things that those systems and bots need is guidance, direction, feedback, which are all critical like layers of like management. And then the last piece to this, and then I'll stop there, and you can certainly tell me what you think or if any of these resonate, is just this idea of leadership moving from just being a noun to being a verb, where, I think particularly, again, and I think many who listen to this podcast can relate to this. When you work in professional services, like your entire job is to get things done by working with others, which is the very fundamental definition of what leadership is to be able to get to an outcome, by guiding others along. And so what that eventually means is that while there will always be formal leaders, AKA nouns, right, in terms of being a formal people manager, being an executive, it almost makes it so that if you want to get things done today, regardless of wherever you are in the org chart, you have to be able to demonstrate leadership, because so much of work, the way that work gets done today, is through and with others. And so those are a couple things. You can kind of pick and choose if any of those resonate or you want to go deeper on those, but those are a couple things that come top of mind.
So much resonates, Al, when you're talking about it. And the two maybe that I just want to drill down on is the employer-employee contract. I think that's significant. From both angles, right? And I think about if you have individual, because you're going to, right? How do you make sure, and what have you seen that works as far as being able to engage people and incentivize and give people that growth trajectory when you really don't have that? And is the growth trajectory outside of your four walls?
Yeah. It's a good question. I have more questions and thoughts than concrete answers. I think there's a lot of people trying to figure this out. Well, what I'll say is this. I think at the end of the day, in the most simplest kind of terms, you have to ask. Make a broad analogy to, a consumer products company. If a consumer products company is wondering if they should launch a new line of a product, let's say it's a box of cereal or a bag of, pretzels or something, one option they could have is just to kind of close their eyes, launch it, and see what happens, and see if people like it. Or the other option is to go out and actually like talk to people to better understand, like, hey, like, what are your preferences, or like, what about this versus that, right? And so, like, at a basic fundamental level, like, you have to ask. Now, where I think people get this wrong, or maybe don't do enough due diligence, and what makes this thing so complex is that there isn't a uniform answer to that. It is incredibly individualized, right? And I think that's what makes this so difficult. Your definition of what you want out of your work and your career might be different than what mine is. And for that matter, that may evolve and change over time, right? And just as, life changes. Denise, as you know, I've got, a 7-month-old son. And so, like, what I want out of my job and my career right now, I could very much tell you is very different than it was 5 years ago. And it'll be different probably in 5 years. But I have the ability to kind of make choices around what I want and how I want to get it. But everyone else does too. And I think that's a shift, because not that it wasn't available before, because I do think it was. I just think it's more commonplace and it's much more personalized and unique to the individual, which can make it so hard for firms, I think, to kind of really figure this out. One concept I'll pull in and as a starting point to consider for folks. One of the things I really enjoy is trying to, as best as I can, look at the science and the research and what it says. And so there's a concept in psychology called self-determination theory. And it's one of the more long-standing concepts around intrinsic motivation. But the idea behind it is that, typically speaking, individuals are generally motivated by one of three, if not all things, which is autonomy, mastery, and connection. So autonomy is having that individual agency and choice. Mastery is kind of the ability to kind of be good at something or evolve and grow over time towards something. And connection is just the ability to relate towards others. And so I feel like that's a starting point for any conversation about what do employees want. Obviously, compensation is going to be part of that, but it's at least a starting point to better understand kind of like, where your employees fall. And the last thing I'll just say is that employers hire employees to do a job, but your employees hire you to do a job as well. And the quicker you can find out why they're hiring you to do that job for them, the more likely you are to figure out how to find ways to create an employer-employee contract where there's value that is exchanged on both sides.
That is a really good comment there. I wrote it down and highlighted it. Employer, you hire someone to do a job, but they hire you to do a job for them as well. I think that's missed a lot of times.
I think so. And that is a concept. So the concept that I'm talking about, more or less, there's a similar concept a lot in product development for consumer companies, which is, around this framework called jobs to be done, which was formulated and researched by the late Clayton Christensen, who's, the father of, disruptive innovation. But the core idea behind it, I think, still applies in the concept of the employer relationship, because, business is an exchange of value, right? And just how customers and companies exchange value, employers and employees exchange value too. And so I think it's a good framing of how you can potentially think about, well, like, why would a company or why would an employee hire you, and vice versa? For that matter, it's actually a great question to do for yourself. Like, why do you hire your company and what job does it play, for you? It's a great philosophical question, but it's also a great tactical one, and can be one that any leader could not just, ask of their people, but could also ask of himself, right? So,
right. Because when you think about it, I think it used to be more flat, and now it's more matrixed approach, right? Where you are in your life, what you need, and then it does shift, and it's harder you have to be very intentional to connect the dots. So
you do.
I like that. Another point that you said that was interesting and I'd like you to drill down on is you talk about leading from wherever you are, basically, right? And I think a lot of people say at times, I have to be a leader, I have to have the title, or else I don't lead. And that is probably people without the title lead just as much, honestly, especially if you're a project manager or you're trying to get something done.
Yeah.
You have to have those qualities. So give us if you can provide some thoughts and like guidance on that.
Yeah, for sure. Look, I'd say like a couple things. Yeah, the first place, again, I'll start with this, is that at the end of the day, like an organization, all it is just a bunch of people that are working towards shared goals, right? Which also means that, Denise, if you or I are working at the same organization, in order for me to be successful, at some point, I'm going to need to rely on you. And at some point, you're probably going to need to rely on me, and we're both going to need to rely on other people to support what we're doing. That is kind of the nature of how work gets done today, and probably will be that way into the future, except that in the future, that will also extend to, again, to probably things that are not just humans, but, other people. And in the case of many of your listeners, that notion extends to not just people inside of your organization, but also with clients and the like. At the end of the day, all leadership is being able to get others to achieve something that you could never do alone. And so if all of us, again, have that as part of our job, you actually need it right now. You don't need it when you get the title, like you need it today. And so your openness and your invitation then is to think about, for where I am right now, for where I am today, how do I find ways to work with and through others to achieve a shared goal, right? And so my invitation to everyone out there who maybe isn't a formal leader yet is to, in fact, embrace the fact that they actually need some of the principles and skills of leadership today, and it can start working on that today. And the other thing I would add to that, and I could certainly talk about how to do that, but the other thing I would add to that is, if you are someone who is not in a formal leadership position, my advice to you would also is to go actually talk to people who are in those leadership positions and ask them, because you have the power and positional authority, do you get to do everything that you want to do? You're laughing because you are arguably in your organization, the top leader. Actually, so let me ask you this, Denise, as the CEO, do you get to do everything that you want to do?
No. And
okay.
In fact, you're a servant leader.
Right, exactly. But I frame that up as a rhetorical question almost, but it's just to show people that look, just because you become a formal leader doesn't automatically make things magically better. And so what a better way to learn how to handle that now, because for the leaders that are out there, they'll very much tell you that, yes, in some instances you do have that ability, but by and large, you still don't. And so I think, though, that is an invitation then just to better understand, okay, well, what do I actually need to practice as a part of leadership to be able to get people towards a shared outcome? Because that is kind of the nature of how work gets done today.
Yeah, the shared outcome. It's key. That was a great question. I should ask others about that too. Good data points. So maybe we could just shift a bit and talk about the idea of career, because I think the idea before was, I'm going to make linear moves, and I'm going to move from this role title to this role title. And we know roles and titles are changing, and they're much more gray around them. And it's more about the attributes. So maybe you can talk to us about the definition of career and how people need to think about it going forward.
It's a really good question. So, I think let's start with a couple things. I think the first thing that kind of comes to mind is that your career is your own to define, and you can define what career means to you. I don't necessarily know, because I wasn't around, back then. I don't necessarily know if that was always a shared understanding amongst the broader workforce population. I think we traditionally have had some more monolithic kind of views on what a career is. And a lot of people kind of use that as a way to as a mental model for how to kind of navigate through their own career. I think as time has evolved, I think other models have come up. But I think the thing that is different today is that not only are there numerous types of models for how to think about your career, but I do think it is the invitation, and in some cases, I would argue the urgency for people to define what a career is for themselves. And I think part of that really stems back to just the nature of work, and that fundamental employer-employee contract has evolved and changed. And the upside of that is that people do have the agency to kind of define what a career is and what they want out of a career on their own terms. The challenge can be figuring out what that is and what you want it to be. Sometimes being overwhelmed by choice is a real thing, right? And I think that also is something that is very difficult when maybe perhaps you were trained or taught or you observed people around you kind of following a specific kind of model for how to think about a career that might be different than the reality of what today is. Again, I can speak for myself here. My mom worked for the same company for 40 years that she retired at. That was what I thought a career was, until I had to go out in the workplace and I entered the workplace during the Great Recession. And so I learned pretty quickly that the way in which my mom thought about her career might not necessarily apply in the same way that I would. And I didn't necessarily know all that at the time, but I had enough awareness to be able to make the connection of, oh, that way of thinking may not necessarily apply to me. And so I have certainly evolved my own kind of definition of it. I think what it also means is that in order to kind of define that, not only do you have to kind of think about that and reflect on it, but you actually have to go out in the outside world to capture enough experiences and exposure to be able to formulate some thoughts and ideas. And the reality of it is that you can do all the thinking in the world, but like you can't really think your way into like growing your career. Like at some point you kind of have to do things. But the benefit of that is that there's never been an easier time than today to be able to do things. So like period, truly. Like there are so many ways in which you can kind of test, explore, experiment. And I think what it really puts the invitation on to anyone out there is to spend some time thinking about what does a career mean to them and what do they want out of their career. But then also to kind of run mini tests, experiments, exploratory things to figure out and to define what that is. I think this can be challenging because I think for a lot of people, we were kind of taught and trained or raised in a way to think about a career that might be slightly different from what I just shared. But the benefit of it is that as challenging as it is, it does really, again, put the agency on the individual to go and author that for themselves versus just accepting writ large of, oh, this is what I need to do.
Yeah, there's freedom to that. And if you love freedom and like to define your own path, it's a beautiful thing. I think some people, like you said, struggle with, I have 20 different bags of potato chips that I can pick. And how do I even start? Right. And I think that's difficult.
It is. It's a real, it's a real challenge. And again, in my experience, I think there's a good, decent population of the workforce that prefers that stability and that predictability. And I don't fault them. And the reason why I don't fault them is because it means they're fundamentally human. Humans are wired to survive. Stability and predictability help us survive. And so I always tell people a lot of times, like if you want to understand anything about career growth, go understand human psychology 101, because it'll tell you everything you want to know. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, but the invitation again is kind of to something I talked about before, which is a little bit around self-determination theory, which, I do think we all kind of, look, like we all have external motivations for wanting to do things. But I think if we look back to the things where we really made an impact in our life, I think many of us would find that they came from intrinsic motivations, right? Where we didn't just do what we were told, or that we didn't just kind of take verbatim what we needed to get done and did it. But like where we actually encountered something where we saw something and then we realized like, hey, like, you know what? No, like I actually want to do this, or like I really want to overextend myself because I think this is important, right? And so, even for those of you who may prefer predictability and stability, I guess my invitation to all of you is to acknowledge that and to look for ways to have that, but also to kind of figure out, well, where can I kind of tap into some of that intrinsic motivation? Because I think the other reality of it is that stability, and there's nothing wrong with wanting a stable and predictable career if you can find it. And I think that like at the end of the day, like you got to find something and do something that ultimately like you sort of at least enjoy, because like if not, it's going to be long. It's going to be a long career.
It's a long haul. It is. It is. And I would say too, you have to understand the attributes or what you're really good at, or what, like you said, motivates you from an intrinsic standpoint.
That too.
Because that's going to be your best guide, going forward as well, to listen to that piece.
For sure. Well, and I, it's maybe the last thing on this that sometimes kind of fights against it is like, it can be tough when everything you've ever been taught really has been geared around like, you need to figure out what you want to do. And like, it's this one thing. Well, like, what if we just remove that for a second? Like, what if it was never meant to be just find that one thing? What if it was meant to be multiple things? What if it was multiple possibilities? That can be challenging, but the freeing part of that is that you don't have to get it 100% right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you embrace the fact that like it could be a lot of different things and that you may change and evolve, well then like what is in front of you that you're doing just has to be good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? And I think that could be a good reframe for people to understand that they don't have to have all the answers. They just need to have a few to keep going. And if they can be open to that more iterative mindset and approach, I think what they'll find are a lot of possibilities and opportunities in front of them.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Al. That we could talk for a long time, and I know we're getting close, and I have one more question for you, and then we can always regroup. My question is, what would be your advice, like top one or two that you would tell early or mid-level individuals about their career, how to think? What would be your guidance?
Sure.
Everybody pencils up or whatever on your keyboard.
The first thing I would say is that is to focus less on figuring it out and focus more on exploring. And I think the best way to explore is just to develop consistent practices and habits that you can revert to over time, right? I love this. One of the concepts I often talk a lot about is this idea of career habits. And, just like we can have habits to live healthy in our lives, we can create habits in our career to build and grow meaningful careers. And so it's really less about kind of thinking about your career on an episodic nature into thinking about your career in a continuous nature. But again, as I was saying before, that also relieves a little bit of the pressure of like instead of having to put all this effort to try to figure it out once a year, if you just commit to small practices and habits that you can do consistently over time, you do them less in the moment, but they build, right? And every time you do a habit, it compounds to the next thing. So the first kind of would be more of a mindset and an approach of incorporate thinking and doing something for your career kind of daily, weekly, monthly versus trying to, once every blue moon, try to go and figure it out. I would say the second thing would be just around, I would encourage people to not suffer in silence. Your career is your own, and yes, it's on you to kind of take it in the direction that you want, but the success in your career is often correlated to the amount of people that want you to succeed. And so the more that you can talk to other people, ask for help and advice, do things together with other people, the more you're going to have other people wanting to help you succeed and advance. And, the more that people know what you're looking to do or how you're looking to grow or like how you're trying to kind of navigate through your career, the more people that can reach out to you to say, hey, have you thought about this? Or, hey, I thought of you for that. But that only happens when you start building relationships and sharing with others, asking for help, trying things, asking for help, asking for feedback and the like. And so, yes, you do have to take the action, but you're going to need the support of others to kind of like go and actually do it. And then maybe the last thing that I would say, on this would just be to really embrace kind of experimentation and really, again, making this less about trying to figure it all out in this grand kind of thing and more about testing like a hypothesis about something, exploring it, learning from it, and then using it to do kind of the next thing. I like to kind of think of this about how scientists often think about kind of building bodies of knowledge in their profession, right? They formulate a hypothesis, they conduct an experiment, they get a learning, and they use that to kind of fuel whatever study they're going to do next. And I kind of think about your career in the same way. The goal for a scientist isn't to figure out their entire field with one experiment. Their goal is to learn more and contribute more so that they can keep building that body of knowledge. And I like to think about your career can be done in the same way.
That is great. I have a couple notes here too, but the ask, I was going back and you said that in the middle or beginning, right? And then the ask again, how important it is to just ask, I guess, be curious and experiment. That's part of the curiosity too. That is.
Indeed.
So Al, thank you. I learned so much from you every time I listen to your Edge of Work is the podcast. It's on Apple or Spotify, correct?
Yes.
Please listen. I would just listen to one. Al has so many great topics out there, but and always great guests too. So it's a go-to for sure for me.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for being here with us. We'll have to have you back again to talk about some of these other ideas, but just appreciate everything that you do for the workforce and for all of us who are trying to lead in a really difficult time, but a time where we can all grow too.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, Janice.
Thank you.
Rise and Stride is produced by the California Society of Certified Public Accountants. To learn more, visit calcpa.org.